Today we're going to talk about powering up your pelvis. Now, one of the most interesting things about back pain is that everyone talks about the spine, and we forget that the spine sits on a pelvis. And I've got my little skinny guy here, obviously clearly to show you the spine, which runs from the skull right down to your tailbone. But if you can get a feel for what the pelvis is, it's these two wing bones which join together at the pubic symphysis, and then they straddle this triangular shaped bone called your sacrum, which really is the base on which your L5 sits, and then your L4, L3, all the way to the top of your head. They're like little building bricks, your vertebrae. Then we have the ribs coming in, which affects motion. We have our scapula, which affects motion, which we've sort of talked about before. But this week is all about having a look and exploring your pelvic motions. You can imagine if this guy has a pelvis that tips up, then his spine has to side bend to keep his eyes on the horizon. If he has a pelvis that's twisted one way, that puts a really strong corkscrew through his spine, which will create disc torsions, which will narrow exit canals for nerve roots and create problems within the spine. But it doesn't matter how much you focus on treating the injury in the spine, if you haven't corrected the torsion that created it in the first place, there's every chance something else is going to brew long after you've settled down the original problem. Pelvises have 8 motions, ideally. Everything's in an ideal world. Some of us have reasons that those 8 motions are never going to be possible, and that's okay. We just want to maximize what we can access. So this week, I'm going to take you through day by day the different pelvic motions and have you explore them in your own body. Effectively, these motions we replicate or we access, ideally, every time we take a step and transfer our body weight on our foot in preparation for the next step. Our pelvis is required to do these 8 motions every footstep. And so if we're missing them, or if we're compensating in some other way, then we're missing an opportunity to access and activate the muscles that we really want to be, but we're also creating load and stress in other places. So the 8 motions, just so that in your mind's eye, you can get a visualization of what they look like in a 3D framework, but then I'll go through them myself. We're going to start by learning them first up on the floor, which is a really nice way we've talked about before to get that sensory input to help your brain learn what they should look like and feel like. Then we're going to progress them to a chair or standing, and then we're going to talk about how to use them in your everyday motions, like when you go for your walk or when you're standing around talking to people. If you think about the pelvic 8 and daily you check in and go, am I accessing my 8 motions? Then the nice thing is, if you are, you will be activating all of the muscles in your core. You cannot do the 8 pelvic motions and not activate all the muscles in your core. And in fact, when we talk about core workouts, again, it's a bit of a myth. My question is always, well, why isn't the core active in the first place? We know it switches off when there's pain, and we know that you develop faulty movement habits when there's pain. And it's the way you move that determines what muscles are working or not working. You can activate those muscles and work hard at reintroducing them back into the system, but if you don't move in a way that supports their ongoing activation, they fall asleep again. So no matter how hard you work at activating your core or activating your glutes or lengthening that tight psoas, if the way you move doesn't allow those muscles to stay in balance, you will be perpetually in that necessary cycle of having to stretch or strengthen an underutilized part of your movement system. And so the way I think about it is, well, let's just move into those 8 pelvic motions every day. And then we're not having to chase one muscle or lengthen one muscle because it's not getting what it needs. The other point with 8 pelvic motions, if you think about it, every person has a unique combination of orientation of their pelvis based on the input from our eyes, the input from our ears, the injuries we've had in our legs. It's sort of factored in. Our body's always moving and coping with what we do to it. Our habitual movement pastimes, our occupations, our sleep postures, they all feed into our particular pattern of movement. And it's the reason why when I'm assessing someone in back pain, I rarely see the same combination of alignments. It's almost hasn't happened yet. And if you think about this as a mathematical equation, first of all, this pelvis, depending on what these feet are doing, could be anywhere. It could be shifted a bit to the right. It could be elevated on one side. It could be facing to the left. And it could be arched excessively forward. That's 4 combination of movements that person has combined to create a really wonky pelvic arrangement. If I then sent them to a yoga class and said, stretch out your back, or they jumped online and Googled best yoga stretches for back pain, that is not going to address their unique pelvic alignment. In fact, some of those movements have every potential to make that pain worse. Some of those movements might create a lot of ease. The movements that take people out of the postures they're jammed into usually feel good. It's relief. The spine is saying, oh my God, thank you. I like this position because I've been stuck in a different one for years. Likewise, if you try and move a pelvis that's already stuck even further into its dysfunction, there's likely that there'll be a pain signal and a pain response. And the person will be thinking, but this is what my physio told me to do, or this is what YouTube says is a great exercise for back pain. And that's where we get into a lot of trouble, because your back pain and your alignment are unique to you. And I can't tell you the best moves for you until I've looked at what your pelvis is doing and where it is in relationship to your rib cage. Because even if your pelvis is doing some wonky things, guess what? Then you might have a rib cage doing some wonky things. And then the poor old head might be shifted left to keep its eyes on the horizon. So we are marvelous creatures of innovation, and the possibilities of how we can align these structures is endless. Like, as a mathematical equation, just the pelvis alone, you know, I forget how maths goes, but 8 by 8 by 8 by 8 comes to mind in terms of possibilities just for our pelvis. So keep that in mind. And as we're going through these pelvic possibilities, I want you to understand there's no right or wrong, because I would say very, very few people, even people who are not in back pain, have a balanced pelvis. We want to be working towards keeping it as optimally balanced as possible, but it doesn't matter if it's a little bit wonky in a few directions. What we're trying to establish is finding the major blocks, the painful motions, because that's a clue that we probably will wanting to be learning to go in the opposite direction. When you're in pain, the biggest mission is to find the movements that soothe and be repeating them intentionally until your pain eases. Once you've had a period of stability of less pain, then you might start to explore the motions that were previously the no-go zones, just to start to inquire of the body, when is a good time for me to revisit these and to see if they are now open for business. The body will always let you know. And if you repeatedly move your pelvis in a direction that says no, you can trust there's a really good reason for that. And you need to respect that signal. So where possible, I want you to, by the end of this week, to have a feel for, oh, okay, there's 8 motions in my pelvis. I know how to do 3 or 4 of them really well, really easily. And there's 3 or 4 that they don't feel smooth. I don't feel like I have a lot of movement. Perhaps they hurt, perhaps they just feel stiff. So you're gaining awareness about your particular arrangement of your pelvis. Now, ideally, we build this right the way up your chain. So when I see patients, the first phase basically is trying to get their feet functioning. Then we try and work on centering their pelvis on their feet. Then once the pelvis is centered on the feet, we look at their rib cage and can we center the rib cage on the pelvis? And then finally, we look at the arms and the head. The reason I'm focusing on the pelvis for this particular course is because it's a foundation for your spine. Please be aware that even if we center your pelvis on the feet and you get your 8 pelvic motions, there's going to be 1 or 2 of you whose rib cage is so out of whack that it continues to create a little bit of problem into your pelvis. So it's a top-down problem rather than a bottom-up problem. But the good news is you're going to be able to follow the same rules that you learn for your pelvis and apply them to your rib cage, because the same movements that we go through the 8 in your pelvis are the same 8 that your rib cage should be able to access, and eventually your head. So we can always go there down track, but let's focus right now on getting this pelvis moving in the ways we want it to move. And what are those ways? I'll stop rabbiting on. Okay, so this is our pelvis. First motion that is, I would say, commonly aware of and commonly skewed to one side is the shift, the pelvic shift. So if I have the feet grounded and I slide the pelvis to the right foot, that's a shift to the right. And if I slide the pelvis to the left foot, that's a shift to the left. Really commonly accessed by mums trying to slide that pelvis to one side though, so that they can anchor a child on one hip. Habitual ways of standing usually involve a shift to one side or the other, or when we hurt our foot or our knee on one leg, we tend to shift our pelvis away from it to the other leg, and that can become a habitual pattern. When we shift, we create compression on one sacroiliac joint and distraction or opening or hypermobility on the other sacroiliac joint. So it's a big deal. We ideally want to be somewhere in the middle between these 2 feet. The next one is rotation. So if we think about this pelvis as having headlights, rotation is when our headlights are rotated to the left or rotated to the right. Now in this guy, I'm letting his rib cage follow. I'm anchoring his feet. But often what we see is that the rib cage stays steady and just the pelvis is rotated one way. As I said, this creates like a corkscrewing up through the spine, really uncomfortable. So that's rotation right, rotation left. The next one is a hike and a drop. So if you think about these wing bones, one going up, one going down. When I take one ilium up, I technically am lifting this whole right leg off the ground. Now, we don't tend to see that in people. What we tend to see, or what they'll commonly say, is I have one leg shorter or longer than the other. When you're hiking on the right, you are dropping on the left, and vice versa. So we talk about hike and drop, and it really is just this up on one side or creating a kink on one side of your body, both sides. And that is a hike and a drop. It'll make more sense when I show you on my own body. And finally, we talk about the one that probably we know most about, which is a forward tilt and a backward tilt. So in my language, a forward tilt is when we take our pelvis and face it towards the ground, which creates an increase in the lordosis or the curve in your back. And a backward tilt is when we tuck our bottoms under and we create a lengthening of the lower back. Now, as I said, if I assess someone and they have 1 out of 8 pelvic motions creating some problems, I tend to think this is going to be easy. If I'm assessing them and they have 4, 5, or 6, or 7, or even 8, then I'm just knowing it's going to take a lot longer. So prognosis is really easy when you can see how many planes of motion need to be addressed. And that's part of what you're going to get an idea and a feel for today. So as we go through the week, and we're going to learn 2 of the new patterns each day, if you do that motion and you think that's easy, I can do it, tick. You probably really don't need to do too much more. You're really going to focus on the ones that are sticking or causing issues in you. So just remember that. And if they all feel like they could do a tune-up, great. But if the motion's there and it's pure and it feels free and it feels easy, well, you've ticked that box. You can move on to something else that you think is going to create more of an impact in improving your spinal situation. So just briefly, I will show you the movements. I'll probably just kneel so we can see in the camera, but you'll get a feel. So that one back up. So if I'm doing a pelvic shift, here are my iliums. I'm literally just sliding to the right, sliding to the left. This is a shift towards my right side. This is a shift towards my left side. I'm going to do a rotation. I'm going to keep my ribcage still. So I'm rotating my pelvis to the right and I'm rotating my pelvis to the left. If I took my ribcage with me but kept my eyes forward, it looks like this. If I keep my ribcage still and just get my pelvis to move, it's much trickier, but possible. So you want to be noticing whether one feels easier or more tricky than the other. Hike and drop, impossible to do without my knees involved, but basically when I bend my left knee, the left side of my pelvis drops, the right side of my pelvis hikes. So you can see now there's a downward diagonal line from the top of this ilium to the bottom of that one. And then when I do the opposite, I drop. On the right, hike on the left. My spine is side bending this way, and now it's side bending this way. And then the final one's the tilts. I'm going to do a forward tilt, and I'm going to do a backward tilt. Forward tilt, backward tilt. Now, those motions are possible to be balanced when we have our pelvis centered on our feet. If I move my pelvis off to one side and try and replicate those movements, I will jam. My body will say, I can't do it there. And mechanically, it isn't possible to access all 8 motions equally and freely if our pelvis is not centered on our feet. So factor that in when you're assessing. When we get to the upright motions and checking in, it's going to be vital and crucial that that pelvis is centered on our feet. Otherwise, we will feel we jam. And sometimes it's nice to feel that. So you get a feel for what mechanical jamming of bones feels like versus a tissue injury. They're quite different scenarios. But anyway, there's our 8 motions. So we have shift right, shift left, rotation right, rotation left, anterior tilt, backward tilt, hike and drop.